Downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Shavasana. It's something we should probably talk about. It's in our yoga flows and it's in our vinyasa style of practice. It's something that I think many of us do so often that we become complacent or we truly don't embrace the intricacies of the pose itself and all of the things that are really happening in our body. For those of you who struggle with this pose, I'm going to help try to pinpoint where your weakness is and what we can do to try to fix it. And let's get you to really rock and own your Adho Mukha Shavasana. Intricacies. Let's take a look at the pose itself and then we're going to start breaking it down into a little more detail. Your downward facing dog, up with the hips. Now, is there a difference between a downward facing dog that looks like this and a downward facing dog that looks like this? Is one right and one wrong? Actually, no. They're both correct. Another problem with downward facing dog is each of us are going to look a little different in the pose itself, which is why I want you to start assessing where you need to be in your body. Commonly, if we are tight in the posterior chain, our hamstrings, anywhere in our backside, our downward facing dog is going to look a little more like this. And you'll notice how my tailbone is kind of curling under. When the backside is tight, we need to focus on bending the knees and just focusing on trying to lift the tailbone to the ceiling. I'm easing the burden of my hamstrings by bending my knees. As soon as I straighten, I tend to come up here. Now, if you think this is the case for your body, I want you to apply a little trick. Anytime you come into a fold, which technically we are coming into some version of a fold and we're tapping our backside, I want you to think of a cow pose. When I'm coming into my cat-cows, I round and curl my cat pose, and then I lift the tailbone. There's my cow pose. Let the tailbone lead you into your downward dog. Toes tuck, hover the knees. Take your time. Push the torso back to the thighs. My tailbone still leads me into my pose. As soon as I come all the way up and try to straighten my legs, tight hamstrings, I'm gonna come up here. So always focus on booty up, right? It's gonna lead you into your pose. Let's look at our second biggest offender, which is something having to do with overhead range of motion or lack of strength. It could be a little bit of both. If I'm struggling with something going in that upper body and I come into my downward dog, I may not be able to push back appropriately in my head, and my weight is more in my hands than my feet. The focus is to get an equal balance between the hands and the feet. This might take time, we just need to work on range of motion in the upper body to get you to where you need to be. One more thing I want you to just be considerate of, and I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that this is probably a smaller part of the population, but that's if you have hypermobility in your shoulder joint and what we can do to help prevent injury there. If you are hypermobile, once in your downward facing dog, there could be this tendency to dump your lower body towards the floor. As where if you are hypermobile and you're sagging, maybe your forehead is on the floor, you need to focus on scaling back a bit. I'm gonna use maybe 20% more muscular engagement to pull myself back into my expression. So if you notice you come into your pose and you can touch your forehead to the ground or you feel this huge sagging in your pose, that's something that you might want to look at. I know most people who are hypermobile in their joints know that they're hypermobile in their joints and it's maybe been an issue in the past. Just keep that in mind. The idea that we have to get our heels on the ground in downward facing dog, it's not really that important. Now, if I wanted to cheat this and appease my ego, I can just walk my feet a little closer together. From downward facing dog, My heels are just about touching, but they're not touching quite yet. If I take a step forward, I could put my heels on the ground, but am I really tractioning my spine? I'm not, and I can't. The only thing I'm doing is I'm really just appeasing my ego because my heels are on the floor. So I want you to be mindful that that is not so important. The distance between your hands and feet typically can come from an extended child's pose. So if my hips are on my heels and I extend those arms out in front of me, I can rock through, tuck the toes, remember booty up, tailbone lifts, Adho Mukha Shavasana. My heels are not touching the ground, and I really don't care. You can also test your dog once you're in it by lifting the heels, roll through. Notice I'm pretty much in plank, so I'm not too far over the wrists, I'm stacked right over the wrists. Lastly, we're going to talk about a very common error that I did wrong for years, and this is the one that worries me in regards to shoulder impingement. I had shoulder impingement. Did my downward dog have something to do with it? Quite possibly. Even though my downward facing dog might look okay, the thing that I'm forgetting to do is really wrap and spin my biceps outward so I can feel this sense of hugging my shoulder blades into my back. It's a small cue, but it's an important cue. So what can we do about this? Let's talk about it. There are a couple things we can do, and what I recommend is starting from a child's pose. If I extend my arms out in front of me, which is also my hand and foot placement for downward facing dog, notice I have all this range of motion in my arms where I can really spin and wrap my bicep, and I'm noticing the eye of my elbow points forward and then it faces to each other. So the first thing to do is just figure out if you can wrap your biceps from here without all the body weight on your hands. So I can really just focus on what that feels like in my body. You should feel a broadening through the back body. My elbow creases are pointed somewhat forward. Now, if this is an issue, you can take your hands and rotate them out slightly. I don't mean turn them sideways. I mean rotate them out slightly. I almost try to draw a line from my index finger to the front corner of my mat. So that way I have a slight external rotation, which will help me open up and spin those biceps. Rocking forward, my biceps are still spun open. I can nice and slow come back into my downward facing dog, where I can feel that sense of wrapping energy in the biceps because I set it before I came up. Oftentimes, you'll notice that everybody's creases of the elbows tend to face each other versus forward. Use the energy in your hands. I imagine trying to spin open 2 pickle jars or 2 jars of peanut butter where I can energetically open, right? When I have my hands locked to the floor and I open my pickle jars, right? I can spin my biceps, right? And feel that sense of rotation, a nice broad back. Now, once you get into the pose, you feel your biceps wrapping, what I want you to focus on is taking the energy into the L of the hand here. So I'm gonna go thumb and index finger are really pressing to help get that sense of wrapping and pulling the energy up and into the arm. Now, hopefully if there were any overall weaknesses in the pose, that some of those suggestions brought them to the surface. Now let's take a look at some of the things we can do to help deepen and help you find a deeper level of your Adho Mukha Shavasana. We're gonna get started with our strap. Since we were talking about those arms, I want you to come between the forearms with your strap. I have my very slight external rotation to the hands. Spin the creases of the elbows forward as I come up and back, finding my expression. The strap is here to give us feedback. I can energetically push out into the strap and push up and back in a way. So I'm really feeling a lot of the strength in my upper body to help support my pose. Always ensure that you're long through the back of the neck. You might need to shake your head a little bit here. So using this strap to help strengthen and bring awareness to what's going on in your upper body, especially if you're one who's guilty to have those shoulders roll in. Once you're comfortable in your pose, now we need to learn how to firm and tone our legs and incorporate an internal spiral. So I want you to think of a Pez dispenser. Use your yoga block. From downward facing dog, I'm gonna place that block between my thighs. Squeeze your block, you're gonna feel your thighs engage, and imagine trying to shoot that block to the wall that's behind you, right? So I'm focusing on squeezing that inside of the block with my thighs. And the best way I can describe this is a spreading or a blossoming of the sit bones. While I have you here, thinking also about the core. On the exhale, you draw the navel in, imagining trying to suction and create compression through the core and massaging the internal organs. And I'll add a little sparkler. If you've never done this, you're gonna love it. From your downward facing dog. Working on ankle mobility and range of motion, I'm gonna take one foot and slide the big toe and the second toe down towards my Achilles and use the foot to help draw the heel closer to the floor. If you've never done that, it is an amazing stretch for the calf, the whole back line. Now for my individuals with shoulder injury or wrist pain, we can work from dolphin. Lots of times we take dolphin like this, which causes the shoulders to round in a little bit. I do suggest holding a block between your thumb and index finger. That way I can keep better alignment in the shoulders, and you'll notice the pose is very similar. I can still do a lot of the same things from this expression. Tailbone still high, I can firm and tone the thighs. Dolphin versus downward facing dog. If the issue is solely in your wrists, you can get something which is a little wedge, or I can show you how to create one for yourself. And this is just going to ease the compression on the wrist, and that could completely alleviate the problem if you have any pains in your wrists when you come into your pose. Your alternative to that, if you don't have a wedge, is just to take the front of your mat. You can give a little roll, and you're gonna create that same wedge for yourself to come up and back. See how it feels, see how you do. Some things we can do to troubleshoot. If you know you have tight hamstrings, I'm gonna suggest trying your downward facing dog against the wall. And what I mean by that is coming into your downward dog, and you can place your heels against a wall. I'm gonna go just about to the height of my baseboard. Walk my toes out an inch or two. And really just focus on trying to lengthen the tailbone towards the ceiling, drawing the belly towards the thighs. Here I'm alleviating the need for my backside to stretch so much. And I could focus more on some of those other teaching points, engaging the thighs, spreading through the sit bones. Now, if you have tight hamstrings, you could also take that same pose and really work on getting into that backside. From your wall or countertop, I do suggest bending your knees so that we can find that lift through the tail, and then start pedaling nice and slow. We might need to break some movement patterns that are conditioned in your body for that tailbone that curls under. So really focus on lengthening the tailbone up from bent knees, and then slowly just pedal through. Now, if upper body strength is an issue, what I want you to do is practice your downward facing dog against a wall or at a countertop. This way we're taking the weight out of our arms, and we can focus on the pose and all of our alignment cues without having to take all of our body weight onto our hands. We're coming into the same exact shape of downward facing dog, only we're against the wall. It's much easier for me to hold this pose, actively push the wall away with my hands, or pressing into the countertop. I can still focus on that nice drawing in of the navel, opening up through the backside. Make a habit of doing this a couple times a day. I'm gonna say, while you wait for your coffee to brew or your tea to boil, do this right on your kitchen counter. And this way we're gonna get that upper body a little more conditioned to hold the weight of our body when we're in our pose. Until the overhead range of motion improves, something you can do is just give yourself a little more height with a set of blocks out in front. Come into your downward facing dog just as you would normally with those blocks. And you'll notice you might have a little more ability to find your shape without as much stress. Lastly, it's that ability to really extend up and overhead. Typically what we need to do is we need to work our lats and our pec minor. So what I want you to do is use the wall. I'm just gonna take this angle for a moment. So I'm gonna press into the wall and I'm beginning to feel a big stretch through the side and into my trap as I look away. You can go deeper by doing a little bit of deep tissue release here. So I'm gonna squeeze behind my armpit here, and I'm just gonna do a couple squeezes and releases to help break up and loosen the tissues in here, any adhesions. And I could also just let my body weight sink into the wall. Press into the wall with your arm. If you look away, you'll get a nice stretch for your trap. So good. And release. Make sure you do both sides. One last look at our pose in its entirety. From that child's pose, slight external rotation of the hands, spin the creases of the elbows forward as you rock through. You can test in plank, bend your knees, lift your tailbone, right? Booty up, come back, belly to thigh, coming into your expression. Move freely, right? Micro movements to feel your pose. Full breath in, exhale, navel suctions back. Squeeze firm and tone the thighs and spiral them inwards. Where's the head? Let it dangle. Look through the thighs, maybe up at the navel. The next time that you do a practice at home, I'm gonna recommend that you set your phone up and record your dog. And not from a judgmental or critical standpoint, but just assess, and are you making any of these common errors? Especially now more than ever, considering most of us are trying to do our practices from behind a computer screen or in a Zoom class where the instructor may not necessarily be able to see you. Our proprioception and our body awareness of what we actually look like in space isn't always what we think it is. If you enjoyed this and my nerdiness and love for the practice, consider subscribing. We, of course, do yoga, toning, conditioning, meditation, all the stuff that we need to kind of keep sane in a crazy world. Hopefully I'll see you soon. Namaste.